I could relapse in 2 seconds right now. This is like holding a gun to your head. You see this?
Wait, what is that? Oh, that's the compressed air for your
Dust
what
off.
For your computer? Dust off.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's not for the computer. It's for
Everyone
something else.
Everyone was obsessed with the girl who was addicted to that stuff.
Oh yeah, My Strange Addiction. Yeah, I once got in trouble for at Maximum Rock and Roll. They had ordered like a 4-pack of Dust Off for the computers, and I did all of them in a day. Like, because I had a key, and I went there to review some records, and I did their entire stock of Dust Off. Yeah, I mean, what else are you gonna do? You can't smoke.
I don't know.
I'd shoot Dust Off if I could, but no, you just huff it. Have you done it?
No.
Never in your life have you inhaled Dust Off.
I'm not very dusty.
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein.
I do love Dust Off. I gotta say.
What does it do?
It gets you really high temper. It's like the crack of
like
whippets.
Poppers.
It's like it's office whippets. It's office whippets. Yeah, whippets are if you work at a cafe. It's office whippets. Yeah. I've never worked in an office or a cafe, but I've done a lot of whippets and Dust Off. It's like poppers. You know. It's not. Yeah. Anyways, Dust Off is what straight people do during sex. Hello.
Oh no! I thought we were gonna do it at the same time.
Hello. Welcome,
everyone.
Oh, what? You thought we were gonna do everyone? I don't do everyone.
I know. I thought we were just like looking at each other and doing a thing, but I don't think.
No, I'm looking at myself. I don't have the notes up anymore, so I'm making eye contact.
What? Why are you looking at yourself? You should be looking at me.
Okay. Well, now I am.
No, it's weird. Don't look at me. Don't look at me.
Hi,
everyone. Hello. Hi. Welcome. I'm Liz.
Okay. I'm Bryce. We're joined by producer Young Chomsky. The podcast is called TrueAnon.
Hello, everyone. You're so low energy, Bryce. What's going on?
Did Dust Off.
No, I
don't know. We just did a fucking long-ass interview. What do you expect me to be bouncing off the walls?
Because you're like, hello, everyone. Welcome.
Bitch, I drank a fucking San Pellegrino 2 hours ago, and now
Grace. No, my name is Liz. Get it? It's a joke. Hello, welcome to TrueAnon.
I drank a fucking San Pellegrino. Bitch, I don't want to. I just called you bitch twice. I'm sorry. Now you see what happens when you get.
Why are you drinking San Pellegrino?
Now I don't know, man, because I was like, this seems like it's really hot in my apartment, and this seems like it would be thirst quenching, but it just made me really hyper, and then I got tired.
No, it's soda. You can't quench a thirst.
It's not fucking soda. I thought it was juice. It says real juice on it. It says soda nowhere on it.
No, it says
I didn't
soda
know.
with juice.
I don't drink it that often. I can't remember the last time I had it. Now I'm crashed from it.
All right. Well.
Plus I'm sweaty. Listen.
Liz, you look great.
That's my arm.
No, it's not.
That's my arm. That's me fucking touching my arm.
Such a liar.
It's so, yeah, listen. That's my fucking arm. It's awful. I'm wringing out my arm hair.
Oh my God. What are we doing today? Oh, you did. You mentioned we had a long ass interview. We did have a long ass interview. That is very good.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed it very much.
Huh.
You know what?
Funny you say it was very good because we interview Aaron Good.
No, that's nice.
Oh, you were going to say something else there?
Well, I was going to say what we talked about, but...
They're going to listen to that. What, are they going to turn it off now? You don't got to tell them.
This intro sucks, so they might.
Okay, well, let's say, listen, you think this intro sucks. I drank a San Pellegrino before the interview. It's a great interview. No, we got Aaron Good on. It's a fantastic interview. We're doing a little Deep State 101. We're talking about what's the deep state? What's the regular state? What's parapolitical? What's deep political? We go into all of that. It's a fantastic interview.
What are they up to?
Yeah, what's going on in there? Welcome to the main event, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us here in the Terror Dome, Aaron Good, which is just a fantastic name to say. Also very difficult to Google because there's a lot of sports players, etc., named Aaron who people have high opinions of. He is a scholar of state criminality and U.S. imperialism, and he is here today with us for a little Deep State 101. Aaron, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here with you guys, and this should be fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. So I think that we want to start this off as kind of, like Brace said, a little intro. We talk, very generally about the quote unquote deep state, and that term has been out in, I don't know, popular, thanks to QAnon too, which we can get into, but really out in like popular discourse in a way that almost it's become so broad and diffuse that it's almost lost all meaning. And I think we kind of want to use this time with you to kind of drill home and break down exactly what we mean when we use that term, what it gets right, what it gets wrong, where it comes from, and kind of maybe what are better ways to think of the way that U.S. power is situated, both like, I guess you would say publicly and then privately.
Right. Well, the idea of a deep state evolved in the way that it's been written about in the West, especially with the kind of pioneering work of Peter Dale Scott and Ola Tanander, is to say that the government that we think of as being what we're taught in school, about in government classes, civics classes, that this is not really how it works, and that there's a more permanent kind of power structure in place that's connected to other apparatuses within the state that are partially visible sometimes and then sometimes not visible. And so it arises out of observations about events in history that are not easily explained by conventional understandings of politics. So when Peter Dale Scott started researching these matters in the 1970s, in the wake of the Pentagon Papers being released and U.S. in Vietnam, he looked so much at the intelligence agencies and all these things that the CIA was up to, and he came to the conclusion, like a lot of other people, that democracy, as we understand it, can't exactly deal with the state having the ability to secretly carry out policies, often criminal policies, and to make things happen that it denies happened. And so the definition for parapolitics Peter came up with in 1972 was a system or practice of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. Just meaning that, covert operations are the perfect example, where you hire a bunch of people in Iran to organize mobs, and some of them will even dress up as communists, even though they're Islamist terrorists, and they'll set off bombings in order to discredit the left and allow the military to take more action and overthrow a government and put in a dictator that will do what you want with the oil, right? Like that you're basically having policies carried out that the U.S. public has never approved, probably wouldn't approve. And so how can you have democracy where the people are supposedly sovereign and making informed decisions about politicians when they don't even know the policies? And these are not policies that are unimportant or insignificant. They are historically significant, changing the destiny of countries, decades up to the present. And so parapolitics was his way of trying to deal with these matters. And Peter really is the scholar who's done the most work on that, Peter Dale Scott. Now, through the 80s, he wrote a lot about Iran-Contra. He was even on some documentaries with Bill Moyers and other people.
Yeah.
And he even was on John Kerry's committee that was investigating BCCI.
Oh, that's right. I did know that. Yeah.
And so he did all of this work on the Contras and drug trafficking, and that goes in the 70s. He did things on the drug traffic in Southeast Asia. He and Alfred McCoy. McCoy wrote the most academically respectable book on the CIA and drug trafficking, The Politics of Heroin, which has had 3 editions. And they used to be good friends. They still are friendly, but they even did work together. There's that. I don't know if you ever heard that story where they go and meet a guy who was involved in the drug traffic in Laos, and they show up at his house to interview him, and he says, "Oh, I can't interview you because somebody had been wiretapping them, presumably, and heard that they were going to be that people were going to be asking him questions about the drugs. And so they used some sort of implosive device to burn a hole clean through the door of his car without burning the floorboards.
That is a fair warning, I guess, if that happened to me. I mean, I'd have to know how to drive, but if that would happen to me with some kind of door, bathroom door, apartment door, etc., I would be sufficiently warned.
Yeah, and as a funny aside about the way that our minds work when confronted with this kind of thing, Peter actually forgot about that incident for like 10 years or so, and so did Alfred McCoy. It wasn't until he started to write this poem about as a way of dealing with some depression in the 80s that it somehow he had this repressed memory, and then he called Alfred McCoy and he said, "Do you remember this?" And Alfred McCoy said, "Yeah, I did, and I also forgot about it," because I guess they drove an hour to this guy's house, and it was just suddenly they're encountered with something that is representative of some kind of systemic evil, and they actually just blocked it out of their minds. I guess drove an hour back home and thought, well, we didn't get to ask him any of our questions.
Yeah.
Right? And then they just forgot about it. That seems crazy, right? So he was doing work on this stuff all through the 80s, wrote the book Cocaine Politics with Jonathan Marshall about the Contras. He wrote books on the Kennedy assassination. In the early 90s, he released Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Yeah. And at that point, he takes parapolitics to another evolution, and he starts to write about deep politics, okay, which is, he defines it throughout his books, but he says that it's all of those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. And he said that America had a deep political system alongside the political system that we think that we have. Okay, so it's not that there's no such thing as elections and elected officials and a government and a public state, but that there's also this deep political system alongside it. And he described that as a system in which governance entails habitual resort to decision-making and enforcement procedures outside as well as inside those publicly sanctioned by law and society, i.e., a system of governance that includes collusive secrecy and law-breaking.
Yeah, this idea of the secret seems to be very central to kind of like centers of power and deep power. It's almost like where the secret is where that kind of power lies. Do you know what I'm saying? And like it's where it seems to be a big like kind of foundational part of the kind of like systems of deep power within the U.S. state.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you listen to Peter or talk to Peter, you might hear him say that he really considers himself as building in the tradition of Seawright Mills. If you've ever read Seawright Mills, I would really recommend going back and reading The Power Elite, which was published in 1956. And there's not too many books published in 1956 that I would say are really brilliant in terms of understanding politics and society. Yeah. That book is it's more true it's more self-evidently true today than it was back then. I have a whole section of it on my dissertation where I talk about it.
David Taubeau's book about the Dulles brothers. I mean, he is I think maybe overly long kind of aside about not only Seawright Mills but about that book in particular.
Well, if you think his is overly long, then I don't know how you'll describe mine because I go on for them for about like 17 pages. But he was so his prose is good for one thing, which for a social scientist is almost like unbelievable. And but he is so able to capture the corruption that is sort of systemic in our institutions all the way back in the 1950s when most people were thinking that this is a golden age that we're living in. He said, most of these people in America are not they know that important decisions are being made and that they're not making them, and that they're made the way that America has emerged in this global role has created enormous power wielded by the people at the top of the business world, the military, and the political system, and that they're all basically interchangeable and they're all working, more or less towards the same ends, and they operate in secrecy such that we don't even really understand the sources of big decisions that are being made. And we need to confront this. And so he wrote a lot of things like that was before any of those exposés on the 1960s or on the CIA started to come out in the 1960s and 70s even more, especially after Watergate. But what he was he wrestled with this idea of all of history as conspiracy and all of history as just drift, and was saying that it can't be, it's not that clear. You have structural, systemic forces that impact the way that history unfolds. But you also have people who do have power, and the power available to elites is dependent upon the structure of their society and the technology and material resources at their disposal. And these people have more. He called them commanders of power unequaled in human history. And it was true in the 1950s, and it was true now. It's even more true now. So but that was not the direction social science went into. The people that actually started to deal with information and revelations about the state that came out in the 60s and 70s, because Mills died before JFK was assassinated in like 1962 or 63. And political science went and social science went in a totally different direction, in part because people like Seawright Mills were not, even though he was the most famous social scientist in America, he wanted to do a follow-up to the power elite. So he applied for a big grant from the Ford Foundation. And you have the most prominent social scientists asking for a grant to do some research, and they say, no.
Yeah,
Wow.
totally.
Ford Foundation, that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah, which eventually gets exposed as a CIA cutout, all throughout Europe and the U.S. It's a conduit for CIA funds. So of course they're going to manipulate social science.
Ola Tunander has a good quote about that, with the kind of the problem inherent to liberal political science. Liberal political science has been turned into an ideology of the deep state because undisputable evidence for the deep state is brushed away as pure fantasy or conspiracy. Thus, the problem with liberalism in political science and legal theory is not its ambition to defend the public sphere, political freedoms and human rights, but rather its claim that these freedoms and rights depend on the Western system. And so it's like you're right to point out that, even as these things in the 60s and 70s, these revelations, I feel like, just as an aside, it seems like throughout the 20th century, there's been kind of like, I don't want to say like ruptures or whatever, but there's been moments where this stuff has been a lot clearer, or it seems like there's been moments where it's shown its face a lot more.
Yeah, brushes sort of towards the surface.
Yeah. And like that's definitely a moment in the 60s, I would say, and in the 70s. And at that time, like you say, the social sciences in their, they're gaining so much momentum, so much funding. And there's a reason that all of that energy gets funneled away into its, state legitimation projects, basically.
Yeah, I think state legitimation project is as good a description of the discipline of political science today as I could come up with in just a few words. But there are more open-minded people than you would guess. I was able to get a dissertation committee put together of people who have respect for pluralism and these ideals, even though they are people who have risen in this system by not being too unconventional. So the individuals might be more open-minded, but the journals and such are, in the big universities, they are very much of they're pillars of the establishment. I mean, the academy is a pillar of the establishment, and that's the way it's always, been, I think, probably in any civilization. But there was a opening. It was more open from the 30s through the 60s in many ways, and it starts to in the 70s and 80s sort of close down and become more rigid as time went on.
So when people talk about the deep state, like what literally are they talking about in the American context or just in the general context?
Well, that would depend on which people, were referring
yes.
to.
Yeah.
When QAnon adherents talk about the deep state, they're talking about something that seems to have been taken from a really bad, low-budget thriller or horror movie or something that doesn't really correspond to reality too much. The way that it first entered the discussion, because so Peter Dale Scott comes up with this idea of deep politics, and then independently this other term comes out, which is the deep state, and that comes out of Turkey, where there's something called like Derin Deslet or something. Like Turkish isn't very good, but I think that's the term. But it translates,
maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Something like that, and it translates to deep state. and it was a reference to a number of intrigues and scandals in Turkey and coups and so on that didn't really create any sort of coherent narrative about the cause of it. But then suddenly there's a car crash in this place called Susserlich, and you have like the head of the Grey Wolves terror organization and the top police chief in Turkey and a beauty queen, and they're like people that shouldn't have been together. It would be like if Brzezinski and Cheney and Britney Spears and Osama bin Laden got in a car wreck together, right? And you're just like, wait a second.
Greatest dinner party ever.
Yeah. This car wreck does not fit into my conception of political reality. And so my ideas need to be revised, right? So then this concept of the Turkish deep state came out. Now, the Turkish deep state was more or less a subsidiary of the U.S. deep state. It was connected to those Gladio operations, similar to like what they did in Italy with the Propaganda Due Lodge that involved all of these different elites in and out of the security state and the business world and so on to perpetrate all sorts of, mischief for political purposes. So even that deep state was kind of, an American production and had a lot to do with like the interests of the U.S. and NATO and so on.
Certainly it came out because there was, even before that, you could say that like certain sections of like the army and the bureaucracy within like the Turkish government constituted, it's one of those states where the army has a lot of independence, we'll say, less civilian oversight than in many other, I guess, similar nations. But it's really exactly like when Gladio funds get to Turkey and those stay behind organizations are set up, specifically with the Grey Wolves, that stuff really becomes apparent. I mean, it is even just people I know from Turkey and specifically from some more active regions of Turkey, still talk about the deep state. Like, it's not sort of, it doesn't have the same connotations it has here. It's like a perfectly valid term for people to use there.
Right. And the Turkish deep state, I think, has evolved. There's been all of those different coups and scandals and that like Ergen Khan movie and the Gulen thing. The Gulen thing is a perfect example of it because that guy is pretty clearly, it seems, a CIA cutout of sorts who really, I don't think it's ever been fully exposed what he's been up to, but charter schools and jihadis and heroin traffic
he's like
also.
the like, it's like the greatest Turkish dissident who just really fucking loves charter schools. It's like so weird.
Well, the thing about with Turkey too is that, like, you're right, heroin smuggling plays a huge part in it. Because there are very lucrative, not only smuggling routes, but, basically ways to get heroin from other parts of Asia. Yeah, smuggling routes, essentially, that go through the territory of the Turkish government's enemies, which were the PKK militias in the 80s. I mean, still are, but especially then. And so it was also like, not only did you have these right-wing terror organizations, but you also had straight up mafias involved in this, just like in Italy and just like in America too.
Yes, that aspect is very important. The last thing I'll say about the turkey and the heroin is that, about turkey and heroin, is that Turkish heroin and the U.S. establishment go way back. Like the elites in Boston, like the Cabot Lodges, the Cabot family, Delano Roosevelt's, the Delano side of Roosevelt's family, the Forbes family, Russell Trading Company. They made all their money in trafficking Turkish heroin and selling it to China because of the British were only allowed to sell like Indian opium for some reason. So there was some weird British region that it created an area for enterprising Americans to go.
You got to get on that Anatolian white.
I mean, I'm not the one to be grading different brands of heroin, but they did make a lot of money there. That's how the earliest the textile mills in the U.S. were funded by heroin money. All of Yale is the Russell Trading Company as heroin money. Big parts of Princeton also, heroin or opium money. It wasn't heroin.
That's the coolest thing I've heard about the IVs in so long.
Mm-hmm. The Ivy League.
Yeah,
sorry, we can edit that out.
Oh dear,
we should not edit that out. It was funny.
Okay, so the Turkish deep state aspect of it. So and the mafia part of it. The mafia is a part of what Peter writes about when he was talking even just about deep politics. He was saying, look at these places like Chicago. In Chicago, there's thousands of unsolved murders in the like 1920s and 30s. And it shows that this is very, the mafia organized. You don't just have the government that we learn about with city council and Congress here in one sphere. And then over here, there's this bad area where the people are selling drugs and such, and they're doing bad things. Like the systems are much more intertwined in a way that just is not, presented to people when they study politics and history. I think one of the better depictions of this is Scorsese's Boardwalk Empire, where it's like the main character, Buscemi, is really like a guy in the deep political system there, where he's like, is he a politician? Is he, a mobster? And he's involved with all these other different figures throughout. And, I think that if you watch the entire thing, it kind of goes over that arc of like, it's really a sort of meditation on deep politics in some ways, the deep politics of that particular time period, which was done more on an ad hoc sort of informal. Well, I mean, it's always informal, but like it was a less systemic kind of a thing, I think, because the U.S. and the world were slightly different. It was more of a bunch of different arrangements, a deep political system, like Peter Dale Scott says. So I make the argument in my dissertation that the deep state kind of evolves after World War II. The U.S. assumes a role of global hegemony over capitalism and the capitalist areas of the world, and that these intelligence agencies are so empowered, and they're connected to often organized crime and different illicit economies as well, that what was a deep political system becomes more or less part of the state in some way that has not really been perfectly defined by political science. And that was what I was trying to do. So Peter started to read about the deep state, and he read Ola Tynander's work. Ola Tynander's at like the Peace Research Institute in Oslo that was founded by Johan Galtung, basically the creator of the peace studies as a discipline. And Peter Dale Scott himself established the first U.S. peace studies program at Berkeley, which I think is now defunct, sadly, but this was, I think, a great accomplishment. So when he read more of Ola Tynander and applied it to his own thinking, he came to think more that there was more to this, and that there was a deep state, which he defined in different ways throughout his work. And he's sort of been working on revising that. And I've actually been communicating with him about an attempt to revise it further. I took what he did and said that you needed to think of it in a tripartite sort of system, that you have this national security state with the bureaucracies that we understand and that have been, designed by Congress and created by legislative action and so on. You have the public state of like democratically elected officials and so on. You have some transparency there, but this deep state has emerged between the overworld of private wealth, the underworld, and the national security institutions that mediate between them, and that they're dedicated to U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism, and operating in a way that makes them more or less immune from democratic checks and balances. And so when people are saying this, when you're asking what do people mean when they say it, well, the Trump thing, I think, is like, this is not the way to look at it. But the most generic answer, is that the deep state is the various institutions that collectively exercise undemocratic power over state and society. And not that it's a monolith, because it's pluralistic. There are different competing factions in it. And some of the times that more interesting things come out or are exposed is when there is some conflict in the establishment, especially Watergate. Watergate is very significant.
Cowboy
in that
Yankee
way.
War.
Right. And there's another person who was well known, and as a thinker, he was in SDS, Carl Oglesby, who wrote the Yankee Cowboy War. Yeah. And there's a lot of
really, really good book to those who are listening.
Yeah, it's very interesting and very easy to read. He was with SDS, part of the New Left, and then as realizing that all the best leaders had been killed, and that Watergate also had connections to some of these assassinations, especially the Kennedy assassination, he came up with the idea of a Yankee Cowboy War, which is a sort of East Coast establishment connected to the Ivy Leagues and so on that were, prominent in American politics. And then the cowboys, who were these Sun Belt or Texas oilmen and weapons contractors who were a little bit more freewheeling and belligerent, and that they fought a war. Now, I don't think his analysis is completely, that it holds up, perfectly well today. Or, I mean, looking back at it now, I don't think his description of Watergate and the Kennedy assassination is exactly that. It's not quite that simple. But what he was writing was in many ways on point, that there was some conflict there about this. At the top of the American establishment, and that Watergate was a conflict over this. And the thing that's notable about Watergate, and I write about this more in my book, and when this does get published, I'd be happy to come back and talk more in detail about it, because it's quite interesting, I found Watergate to be. But if you just step back and look at what happens in Watergate, it looks like a victory for liberals, right? Nixon goes down, the Pentagon Papers expose the lies of Vietnam gets wound down, and so on. So it would seem like some sort of victory for liberals, but the end effect of it all is that both political parties move far to the right. The Rockefeller Republicans basically become Democrats, the Democratic Party. They leave the Republican Party. Gerald Ford drops Nelson Rockefeller as his running mate, even. And the Republicans are Reagan, the defense industry, Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have no party is a home to like the John Kennedy type of liberals, George McGovern type of liberals anymore. They're basically, beginning in the 80s, pushed out of having any claim or any control of power in the U.S. And so the Watergate story needs to take that into account. And I tried to come up with some explanations as to how that all happened.
Well, I think we get a really simplistic narrative I know that we get a really simplistic narrative of the Watergate story sort of fed to us through popular histories, which is that Nixon was a criminal. He was trying to sabotage the Democratic Party through criminal means, through this like bunch of goons he sort of assembled and it's kind of glossed over how he assembled. And there's no real like look back at it. And certainly, I mean, when I was learning about it growing up, definitely no links to the Kennedy assassination or anything like that, but it's all part of the same continuum.
Right, and some of the same actors were involved. Frank Sturgis,
like literally the same. Howard Hunt.
Yeah, Howard Hunt's with the Kennedys thing is weird, but he had that strange confession, and I'm not. Peter Dale Scott believes, and I kind of agree with him, that he was sort of put out there as a distraction in some ways. Hunt was, but Frank Sturgis was one of the Watergate burglars, and he was involved with the very first misinformation or disinformation following the Kennedy assassination, like later that day or the next couple of days, from a Cuban organization he was working with, trying to link the assassination to Castro, because these organizations had run-ins with Oswald and so on. And so Sturgis was involved in that milieu, and he even said from jail that, and he's disreputable, so you can't think anything he says is reliable.
Well, all these guys are.
But he said that we broke into the Watergate to see if they had any sort of information on the Kennedy assassination. So he's a liar, and I'm not saying like, aha, that solves it, because I don't really I don't believe him on this case. But like in this instance, but the fact that he was involved in those different episodes is interesting, and the way that it played out moved America pretty far to the right, and really consolidated what I think is in the 80s with Reagan, that consolidated a tripartite state system where we have this sort of blob. And that's another aspect of it. The deep state can refer to all those institutions that allow for top-down undemocratic rule, right?
Yeah.
In that way, that's sort of similar to saying the establishment, okay? So that would be one way to think of the deep state and have it be a reasonable, useful concept. Another way would be when you mean more like specific organizations or entities or milieus who are able to act decisively and opaquely to affect political events. And here you have institutions like the CIA's connection to organized crime, the CIA's connections to other intelligence agencies over which the public can't possibly expect to have any oversight. Not that they even have much oversight over the CIA, but like when the CIA creates intelligence agencies like they did in Brazil or like they did in Iran, or with Saudi Arabia, their intelligence agencies that are often, cutouts for the
Safari
US.
Club.
Yeah, or Safari Club in that case, where they said we got to dial down these covert operations and these criminal activities. And so these really wealthy people connected to the intelligence agencies in other countries they just create their own CIA so that they can do this stuff. And the CIA, the Safari Club, can't be thought of as part of the U.S. national security state. It wasn't created by any act of Congress, wasn't given public sanction. It's certainly not part of the public state, but it's part of this U.S. hegemonic apparatus. And add to that the fact that they outsource intelligence operations to private corporations. That's totally opaque. You have no idea. SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton,
right?
They're like sort of scarier modern versions of like the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons are sort of like what the FBI. They're like what the FBI before the FBI.
Yeah. Oh, they're still around though.
Yeah, I don't know what they're doing now, but I don't know.
It's lower grade stuff. It's just like union busting.
Yeah, I can believe that. And so this this change in the 80s really consolidates deep political power into a sort of more institutionalized force in the U.S. And so if people want to understand the deep state, like, well, what's an example of the deep state today? Well, Joe Biden just said he's not going to recognize Maduro. He's still pro Guaido. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, oh gosh, what an interesting, coincidence. He has the same policy as Donald Trump, right? There's like some sort of imperial hive mind that makes these decisions. And if you're going to go against him, it's very difficult for you. Like Obama said he was going to pull out of Afghanistan, did not do so. Trump said the same thing, did not do so. And then if you notice, the only time the media really liked Trump was when he was illegally bombing Syria after, an alleged chemical weapons attack that seems very mysterious and, not quite as clear cut as we were told. And so this is the deep state, this sort of permanent apparatus. Some people call it the blob, the foreign policy blob, or they like the blob. They put that on the nation. But more people are just talking about the deep state. I heard Lawrence Wilkerson talking about it, saying this concentration of wealth that the deep state sort of has fostered and maintains is a huge threat to democracy. And we got to really be worried about what they're going to do in response to coronavirus, this great reset. It just seems like they don't need the workers. And Lawrence Wilkerson said, I'm paraphrasing here, but this is about what he said on the Analysis news site with Paul Jay. He said, they're just gonna like somehow have some coronavirus come and just get rid of all these workers that they don't need anymore, right? Now, I'm not endorsing that statement, but that's a guy who worked right under Colin Powell and is not a Trump person. He's anti-Trump. He was part of that group that was there to make sure Trump didn't steal the election even. So he's a guy with connections to the establishment. And even he's saying, my God, these bankers and the deep state are really making it hard for any sort of political reforms.
You said bankers. I want to pause there for a second because I think too that with the proliferation of QAnon's concept of the deep state, that, a lot of times like private wealth somehow escapes a lot of these conversations. I think too also maybe with so much that happened under the Obama admin with the NSA and all of the Snowden revelations that really people tend to only think of the agencies, or they first think of the agencies when they think of something like the deep state, and you kind of forget. But there's a lot of like private capital, like that line between private state, is like very, very porous. And we've talked a little bit on the show about like the Carlyle Group, for example. You mentioned the Ford Foundation. You can think of them as cutouts. They are cutouts, but they're also, it's like there's like a back and forth there, right?
Absolutely. And the CIA, you can't think of it as being separate from the politico-economic elites of the U.S., i.e. the corporate rich. The CIA was created at the behest of Wall Street bankers, Wall Street lawyers.
Exactly. It's the perfect combination of white shoe law firms and the people that they represent on Wall Street.
Exactly, and that explains why they do what they do. I mean, it was at the Council on Foreign Relations where they first started to talk about the need to get rid of Mossadegh and Arbenz before they do. And it wasn't quite clear that the CIA would be involved in those operations. At first, they tried to actually pass around a hat, not a literal hat, but like at a New York club where all these rich dudes hang out, to like overthrow the government of Mossadegh. But then Alan Dulles, made I believe he was the sort of point man on this, made it something that would be in the CIA's purview, and that's when they start doing it. And the guy that wrote the famous elastic clause in the National Security Act of 1947 was Clark Clifford, Wall Street lawyer. And it simply, Truman wanted an intelligence agency to sort of streamline the process and have one central intelligence agency that would be dealing with intelligence in a centralized fashion and deliver briefings to him that were digestible for, a president. And so he creates it. And then there's this one sort of throwaway sentence that, and the CIA shall perform duties as determined by the National Security Council from time to time.
Yeah, that's become just legal justification for everything.
And that's not an exact quote, but that's close enough. And it just, so think about what they were signing and what Truman signed, just like some other duties. Like if I said, okay, sit tight, I got to go do something, and then I left and came back, like you wouldn't assume that something was
9/11
mind control programs.
Yeah.
Sexual blackmail operations, coming up with like darts made of ice that'll give people heart attacks and be silent when they're shot off, and like
sterilizing poor women,
shoot people in the Congo and throw them in a ditch.
Recruiting mafia people to try to assassinate leftist leaders, and
killing JFK.
Yeah, I mean the Kennedy assassination, the assassinations of the 60s. When I wrote my dissertation, I put those out there as like pretty likely state crimes against democracy, and I sort of proceed as though I'm not going to just act like these are mysterious things that we can't quite understand. I kind of made the decision, which was a courageous and or foolish one in political science terms, but I wrote about their involvement in those episodes because to me it seemed like a part of the story I was trying to tell.
When you say the assassinations of the 60s, you mean MLK, JFK, RFK?
And Malcolm X as well.
Malcolm X,
yeah. The Netflix thing on Malcolm X is pretty bad.
Oh, is there one?
Yeah, there is, and they say, well, it's obvious. It was known to be a conspiracy, and it seems that the people that they put in jail for it were not necessarily even the ones that were involved. But the version that they give is pretty weak, and there's some better articles on it, especially if you go to kennedysandking.com, which is run by this Jim DiEugenio, who's also the writer for Oliver Stone's new documentary on the Kennedy assassination that's coming out. But they have good articles on there. And the King assassination also, I mean, the King family, Coretta Scott King asked Bill Clinton, with reference to that civil trial that found that the assassination was a result of a conspiracy involving Memphis Mafia and police and the federal government. She said, Bill Clinton, please reopen this. Okay. And that's Coretta Scott King, who's, a saint by American standards. And Bill Clinton's response is no.
Yeah. First time you said no to a woman.
well. So he couldn't have possibly, Clinton couldn't possibly have had anything to do with the King assassination, and yet he knows not to go there, I mean, even today, like, this is a taboo subject.
Well, RFK knew not to go there with his brother.
Well, RFK was going to go there. He just wasn't going to until he was elected president. That's what is in David Talbot's book, Brothers, that he told confidants that he wanted to reinvestigate the assassination as president and that he needed to be elected first. And so he was planning to do that. And he basically believed that it was CIA, some CIA officials, mafia, and Cuban exiles that were involved. And he wanted to reinvestigate it. And Garrison knew about his suspicions and told him that he needed to sort of go public with it. But Kennedy never did. You can find an interview of Garrison. Well, it's not of Garrison, but it's of Larry King. Remember the CNN guy?
Yeah.
And he had a friendship with Garrison, and he dropped Garrison off at the airport one day in 1968, in like May of 1968, and Garrison turns and says they're going to kill Bobby, and then just walks away, and then Bobby gets killed like weeks later. So he did want to do it. RFK did, and of course we know what happened to him, which is also a very interesting case.
So there's one concept that kind of comes up a lot in writings about this, and specifically yours, is the concept of sovereignty and where that lies when we're talking about the deep state. And that I think is a kind of interesting thing to tease out, because I obviously the general notion is that sovereignty lies with the people of the U.S. because we elect the government and the government is accountable to us. But obviously, when you get to talking about this sort of thing, you sort of one quickly realizes that that's not only not the case, but in fact, it's almost the opposite.
Yeah, this idea of the sovereign is kind of it's Hobbesian. Like that was Thomas Hobbes writing a lot, around the time of the English Civil War, hundreds of years ago, was saying that you needed to basically accept that the sovereign was going to be the sovereign. And in that case, he meant the king. And his argument was, it's a dangerous world out there. And if we don't have somebody in charge, then it's worse for us. So it's better to just submit to the state and allow the state its power, supreme power over life and death, because it's a better bargain than the chaos. But so the other person in political science terms that's very interested in this issue, infamously, is Carl Schmitt, the German political theorist and jurist, legal philosopher, who said in a pithy way, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception," is the phrase, and the exception means the exception to the rule of law. So it means whoever's in charge is the person who can command the state to do something, even when they're not legally authorized to do that, and that there's going to be a sovereign. Always. And so the sovereign has to decide if there's an emergency in a liberal democracy, a republic or whatever, then they can never really get rid of that. They need to have the most that they can do is write into law the circumstances under which the law negates itself, and that supreme power is assumed by whoever holds sovereignty. And this was infamously the doctrine that justified what the Nazis did. After the Reichstag fire, they passed the Enabling Act, and it cited, it's an emergency. It's an emergency. The state is at risk. We got to do what's got to be done. And so the elites who had supported Hitler for just this reason empowered him to go out and crush the left, which is really, that's really what fascism is. It's funny to hear people like Tim Snyder talk about fascism and all these liberal mainstream things. They're saying like, what is fascism? And somehow Tim Snyder leaves out the crucial sort of quintessential aspect of fascism, which is that fascism is capitalism in crisis. This was why the fascists rose up. The situation was so bad, you were going to either have a move towards socialism, or you're going to have the iron fist.
Well, Snyder's whole project is linking it with communism. So there you go.
Well, or this idea of totalitarianism.
Oh my God, don't get me started on that.
Thrown around. And what it meant was these regimes where no part of civil society could counterbalance against state power. And so people were in a perpetually hopeless political state of subjugation, right? But of course, the ironic thing is that we talked about the Soviet Union as this totalitarian state, but their civil society did actually, coalesce in such a way as to bring about the end of the Soviet Union. But if you're talking about a country where no aspect of civil society is really able to put a dent in the hegemony of the ruling elite, it would seem to be America, academia, the corporate media, the Silicon Valley monopolies, the democratic process, the religion. Nothing seems to have been able to really affect a change of course in the American state. And so, I think Sheldon Wolin, when he called this inverted totalitarianism, there's something to be said for that, even if he mostly repurposes Seawright Mills arguments, in my opinion. This idea of like, it is sort of totalitarian what we're dealing with. It's just in a very unique way where we still have freedom of speech that we can exercise. Although you guys have heard, maybe you've heard rumblings of this, but they're starting to talk about podcasts as
I know.
places where there's unreliable information out there. Maybe we just gotta
Oh, we
go after the podcasters next.
After we stop recording, I'll tell you something that's sort of funny that happened yesterday.
It's interesting when you talk about the concept of sovereignty and that kind of Hobbesian notion, or kind of like even a monarchist notion. There was a kind of with a kind of monarchist concept, the idea of like a twin sovereignty, right? Which actually is very similar in some ways to the liberal, like a liberal state, deep state in some respect, where there was like a physical body of a king. There's this idea that there's this physical body, but that the actual, I mean, it's similar to, I guess you would say, the Catholic Church too, right? That there's this physical manifestation of the sovereign, which is the body of the king, which is the guy who comes in and then he dies and then it's another king or whatever. But that there's this like the body of grace, which is the immortal body, which is the one that kind of continues past the, it is always sovereign, and when the next kind of mortal body comes in, it assumes the body of grace as it takes the throne or whatever. And so it's interesting because it seems like there's always been, like, I don't know if there ever has been a state where there hasn't been a kind of separation between a public and a private, or a judicial, if you want to use the like kind of like Schmittian whatever, the like judicial versus the extrajudicial, or that kind of separation.
Yeah, these issues of top-down rule in countries justified by some sort of system of metaphysics, this gets into real conflicts in civilization that are kind of key to understanding these things. Like civilization, human civilization, it was kind of nicer in some ways when we just ran around like picking berries and hunting woolly mammoths and stuff, right? Because there really wasn't the state, right? But once you have people settle down and you have a division of labor, then you have inequality, social stratification, and people emerge as being on top. And then these civilizations have complex systems that are designed to legitimate the power structure. So Plato writes, if you read the Republic, which is kind of annoying to read because he writes it without really saying what he's getting at. This is the right-winger Leo Strauss argues this, and I think in this case he's actually correct, because it's so dangerous what he's saying that he just uses Socrates as a sock puppet and these other guys, right? But he's saying that, in all societies it's the same. He has one guy as a troll who says, in all societies it's the same. Justice is the interest of the powerful. Whoever is strong, that's what they determine what justice is, and that's how it works. So he's sort of saying that it's just a function of power, what people think of and accept as reality. And then Socrates comes in and he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's saying that, well, you're wrong, but let's make up a city. Let's have a city with a special, unique system. And some of the people have golden souls and they get to rule. Others have silver souls and they get to be, military auxiliaries. And then the commoners have like iron or something like that, right? And he's talking about hierarchy and a way of legitimizing hierarchy. And all these civilizations that have human sacrifices and such, these are just to like glorify and sort of sanctify the power of the state. So there's always the divine right of kings. This is like an absurd thing, but it's just supposed to justify why the king is the king, right? The king is the king because God wants him to be the king. And if God didn't want him to be the king, he wouldn't be the king. So go out there and, harvest that wheat or whatever, and stop, don't complain, or we'll have you drawn and quartered. Or, in China, it's a similar thing. It's the mandate of heaven, where like, if you're the ruler, you're the emperor, you have the mandate of heaven, pass it on to your house, that they're your heir. And then if eventually things get really bad and you get overthrown, then it's because you lost the mandate of heaven. It's proof that so it's all sort of circular ways to justify hierarchy. And the, systems of exploitation and expropriation that are like inseparable from civilization. Civilization is a story of exploitation. And if there's no exploitation, then you can't develop. You have to have people that are contributing, the barest stuff like food, so that other people can, design airplanes and stuff like that. So it's always based on getting more from people than they are compensated for. And this is a conundrum of civilization that we haven't been able to resolve. And the way that fast forward to today, the way that the deep state sort of operates is maintaining a extremely unequal system, and it has to be done in secret, not completely in the open, because it goes so against the legitimizing myths that we have about openness and liberal democracy and so on. And so if you think of most of human civilization as being, despotism, people living under some kind of despotism, then like our liberal democracy is like a tiny fraction of that amount of time. It's not like, oh man, everything was great and now we have this despotism. Like these different democracies, such as it was always flawed, but we've been living through several decades that have moved in anti-democratic ways that don't conform to what our textbooks say should be democracy. And the deep state is a way to try to explain the actual workings of this system.
Yeah, in that Ola Tunander essay that you mentioned, there's a quote from Licio Gelli, who was, we've mentioned him quite a bit on the show, but he was the head of the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy and a big player in Gladio in Italy's strategy of tension. There's a quote from him that I hadn't heard before, which he says that dictatorship and democracy always march side by side because democracy is being undermined by dictatorship and dictatorship is being undermined by democracy, adding that we have not yet reached an equilibrium. And I think that is a pretty good kind of description about what actually the tension that actually happens here. I will say that I think dictatorship, which I don't know necessarily that I would use that word specifically, although maybe in Italy, I do think that concept is really useful, sort of that aggressive arrangement between the two and the wranglings between the two. I think cause a lot of the stuff that we see day to day.
Yeah, and liberal political theory doesn't have exactly the perfect way to conceptualize it. So when you're saying it's dictatorship isn't exactly the perfect word, maybe like authoritarianism would be more like from a social science way of describing it. Maybe that would be better. But you're right. It's not perfect, but that is similar to what happens. And John Locke, the guy, the English Enlightenment thinker, who kind of forms the basis of a lot of America's constitutional thinking that influenced the founders and so on. He wrote about the emergency also, and he kind of doesn't come to conclusions that are that different from Carl Schmitt, even though he's thought of as like Mr. Separation of Powers, Mr. Limited Government, and so on. That he says if there's an emergency, then you're going to have to empower the head of state to act. And he actually hashes out some of the possibilities and says if there's a tyrannical person abusing this authority, then only an appeal to heaven, that's your only resort. And by that he means revolution. So that idea of a state of emergency, like what Carl Schmitt wrote about and like he refers to, this puts enormous power in the state, in any state. And what happens with the U.S. after World War II is they go for global hegemony, and it's legitimized. These different systems that are set up in organizations like the CIA are set up on the basis of, in part of, and empowered especially to carry out, extra legal things on the basis of this existential threat posed by the Soviet Union. Yeah. Which in effect, the Soviet Union they lost 26.6 million people fighting World War II. They were not a threat to the United States, at least not in any conventional way that in international relations, the idea of a threat was understood. Okay. They function often, in my opinion, as a kind of boogeyman to legitimate policies that the U.S. and U.S. economic elites pursued before World War II,
and comfortably replaced with jihadist post fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, eventually that way. But they still are doing some of the same things. I mean, there's a coup in Honduras because they tried to go after a banana company in like 1912, 1913. It was like a sort of low budget CIA coup, except there wasn't a CIA at the time. It was just done by a banana guy, Sam Zamuri, who was later one of the people involved in United Fruit. Now, in 1954, he's involved in the coup in Guatemala in terms of like trying to rally support for it among the elites and such. So, but this time it's communism. It's because of this Cold War. But the policy is the same thing. It's a powerful, fruit company in Central America that is aggrieved by a government that's going to impact its bottom line, and so they overthrow it, put in a dictator. And fast forward to like Obama's administration, or even under Bush, we overthrow Aristide twice. There's no Cold War to justify that. We just overthrew him twice. 2 different years. They overthrow him, and then actually no, it was both Bush administrations. This is like a Bush family tradition is to go stick it to Haiti. Because they haven't had it bad enough, I guess.
Bush family.
I was going to say the Clintons that's one of their big passions as well.
Yeah, I would say I don't think that I think there's a spiritual element to the American government going after the Haitians for so long.
Yeah, William Robinson, the sociologist, said that they had the first successful slave revolution overthrowing a Western government, and that the white people who rule the world have never forgiven that.
They're never going to forget it.
Since. But additionally, if you want to talk about like some deep state shenanigans, like look at Venezuela. I believe it was in like 2009. This guy Ramon Guillen de Villa was arrested for plotting to assassinate Chavez with complicity from actors in the United States. And he was a guy who had been arrested because he brought some stuff into Miami that you were not supposed to, in this case, 9 tons of cocaine. And then he's released because he has some sort of special relationship. But he was a huge cocaine trafficker. And these are the guys we're still working with in 2009. And there's no Cold War to justify it.
I mean, Christ, I might be wrong, although I don't think I am. I believe a Croatian, son of Croatian fascist was implicated in a plot to kill Evo Morales. And this sounds like something out of the 1970s or something. But this happened I think within the last decade too. Yeah,
the networks of organized crime, and they make for convenient people to get to do the things that need to get done. That's what's something that's left out of when you've heard the new Cold War is ramping up, and so they're talking about Xinjiang, China, where there's this genocide that we are told is happening, and I can believe that the Chinese government is taking a hard line on Islamist terrorism there, but there have been incidents in Xinjiang. And a lot of people, Muslims from Xinjiang, have magically wound up fighting in Syria, attacking Assad alongside other U.S. Al-Qaeda frenemies who are well armed. And then they come back to Xinjiang. Okay, now, what is the mechanism by which somebody in Xinjiang, which is pretty remote, finds himself in Syria? I mean, I would have to imagine that the U.S.
huge
and
amounts
the
of them
Saudis,
in Turkey as well. They have a exile. Like a government exile or just a party in exile that's based in Turkey. That's propped up by the Turkish government, which of course is in NATO.
Yeah, and they want to call it like Eastern Turkmenistan or something like that. They're really emphasizing their Turkish ethnicity. But the thing is, like, would the U.S. and if their Saudi allies, do we think that they might be using these jihadi networks to carry out terror attacks? And then when the Chinese respond to this threat of jihadi terrorists, and they take a hard, line, then the U.S. just uses that as PR. Like, oh, look at how terrible they are. Look at how they're disrespecting the rights of the Xinjiang people who we care so much about. But those jihadi networks, like, what are the odds that the U.S. and the Saudis and the Turks are not using them for geopolitical purposes? And it doesn't even Ben Norton writing at the Gray Zone gets close to this, but he doesn't actually. Nobody has written that piece yet. I wish somebody would write that and try to look at that, because I bet that there's some interesting stuff there about these jihadis in Xinjiang.
So you mentioned the state of exception, and actually it's funny because I feel like everyone, like, people can't stop talking about Carl Schmitt. Like, it's not just like academics, it's like the pages of the New Republic, which is a little scary. Kind of like, don't want like New Yorker liberals talking about the fucking Carl Schmitt. But putting that aside for a second, the state of exception, you mentioned that the U.S. Post World War II, like, how did it come to be that the U.S. just operates kind of under a permanent state of exception, which is how it's basically governed since, I guess, 9/11, right? Or do you think prior to that?
Prior to that, and I'll try to explain why. So the article and also my dissertation, although the dissertation has a different subtitle, but the article that I published in Administration and Society in 2015, I coined the term to explain this. I call it exceptionism, and the article and the dissertation are both called American Exception, because the state of exception that Carl Schmitt first elucidated gets institutionalized in the United States during the Cold War, that the U.S. is in violation of laws all the time. The CIA carries out things that are illegal all the time. And the common response to that idea from mainstream political scientists is to say that, well, you're talking about international law, and that doesn't really count because the international law is really just sort of informal and agreements between people. Yeah, which there's an argument to be made about that having historically been the case. However, in the United States, in the United States, we have our Constitution, and the Supremacy Clause states that ratified treaties are the highest law in the land, which means that the U.S. is violating the Constitution when it violates treaties that we have ratified. We have ratified the UN Charter. The UN Charter establishes that it is illegal to act aggressively against other nations, so to attack them militarily, to try to overthrow their government, to invade them, and so on, to assassinate their leaders. Those are violations of the UN Charter, which is ratified by the U.S., and therefore violation of the U.S. Constitution. And it's so routinely violated that, I wouldn't even try to guess how many things the U.S. has done that would be considered violations. I mean, it would be, and huge numbers of them on a weekly basis where we are violating the UN Charter. The occupation of Syria is totally illegal right now. We're occupying parts of Syria, completely illegal, unless it had been given approval by the United Nations Security Council. That's the only way it can be considered legal, according to the UN Charter. That's why Kofi Annan said about the Iraq War, it's illegal. Okay, he is not William Blum or Noam Chomsky or some other radical. He is a guy who wouldn't be in that position if he wasn't friendly to Americans. And even it was so clear cut, he even had to say it's illegal. So this exceptionism, I think, is something to that we, if we really want to be looking to move the U.S. in a positive direction, adherence to international law and domestic law would be a big start to moving in a direction that's more bottom-up, democratic, transparent, and just.
I think part of that has to probably do with the fact that I think all of these sort of international, Norman Finkelstein, when we interviewed him, we actually didn't talk about this, but this has been one of his big things lately, is that he really is calling on the U.S. to respect, and Israel specifically, but, by extension also the U.S., to respect international law with regarding Palestine. But I think for me, just as purely as a layman, I've always seen international law as something as sort of like, it's kind of one of those things that's like opt in or opt out. And like, if your country has, a high enough GDP, or, usually if it's wide enough, you can opt out. But, maybe if you're a Central African Republic or something like that, you can't quite afford to opt out. And so I don't know, like, I guess what I'm saying here is that, like, it's almost like basically all Western nations are sort of in a state of exception, or not even just Western nations, but most major countries are sort of in a state of exception when it comes to international law. Because while the U.S. is different than a lot of countries in that we, like, for instance, not even just ignore, but, put sanctions on prosecutors for the International Criminal Court or something like that, and certainly put a lot of pressure on members, on the members of that body. It's just one of those things that you can just ignore, which is, I think, astounding, and certainly, basically in line with the whole of the 20th century. Like I said, the League of Nations, you want to invade Abyssinia? Well, go ahead. No one can stop you. They'll put sanctions on you for 6 months and then drop them. And I think that really has to just do with, like, it's not in essentially any country's interest to pay attention to these international laws, especially when nobody else does.
Well, the main violator of international law is the United States in terms of just the sheer amount of different violations. China does not violate the sovereignty of other nations. They haven't overthrown any governments. They haven't invaded any other nations, or at least it's been quite minimal. Did they invade Cambodia?
They invaded
North
Vietnam.
North Vietnam. North Vietnam invaded, and they've had skirmishes with Vietnam also.
India, but I mean, it's literally just like fist fights, so I'm not really sure that rises to the level of a conflict.
I mean, nothing on the scale of what the U.S. has done. I mean, the U.S. overthrown Brazilian democracy in '64, and then also more recently with Dilma Rousseff and the whole thing with Lula. That's the U.S. obviously. We overthrew Australia's government in like 1975 or 76.
Never recovered.
Yeah, and that was with in one of the entities involved with that was the Nugan Hand Bank. Again, talking about the deep state.
Well, I would say China in Angola was probably in violation of international law, but kind of everybody was there.
That was a civil war, and the details. The Soviets were involved there also. So the details of that, I would have to. You could be right. I'm not trying to put a white hat on
so basically
China,
everybody was there. Yeah.
But if you're invited by the government, such as it is, then it's like for Russia to be in Syria, they're not violating international law. Because they've been invited to be there. The U.S. is, whether you think Russia has good motives or not. I'm not going to put a white hat on any of these statesmen,
or a helmet.
That's a whole separate issue. But that the white helmets, which I don't want to say too much about.
It was too easy. I had to do the joke.
If you want to talk about a depth of cynicism that they have sunk to, the white helmets, this idea of flooding jihadis into a country, taking it over, and then having these guys out there rescue the people that when the government tries to kick out the jihadis that you've put into their country, and then you act like they're heroes and that they're noble. I mean,
you get
it's
an
one
Oscar.
of the most cynical things I've ever seen, even as somebody who studies this stuff.
I'm expecting them to come back for the Biden admin.
White Helmets is over. It's like season 2 now. Like they've kind of been written out of the show. No, they don't really need. Everyone's in Idlib now, and like the last thing I saw of the White Helmets is they were literally rescuing a kitten, which who knows how the kitten got there, from a telephone pole. So I'm like, if they're doing that, that's
maybe they'll show up in Ukraine in a couple weeks or something. I think after that guy was so despondent, their British intelligence linked founder got so depressed over I'm sure just the amount of ghouliness he had to see in Turkey that he flung himself out of a third floor window to his death. It kind of wrapped up after that. You need a good director.
It's a weird case. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, of course, but there's something very strange about his death.
You're going to throw yourself out of a window. Third floor? That's like 50-50 chance of dying.
Yeah. That's not... Yeah.
That's not good. I could literally just go to a taller building.
That's jumping out a window. That's not falling. You know what I mean? That's just like... You could land on your feet like a cat.
Well, if you guys check the CIA assassination manual that was made in at the time of the Guatemala Operation Success in 1954, one of the things they say is, one way you can kill somebody is to just be standing next to a high balcony and just push them over the edge, and that has the benefit of you being able to play the frightened bystander. So you can just shove a guy off. See you later. Oh no, what happened to Johnny? Oh man, somebody help. Like that. So, is that what happened there? Who knows?
So speaking of people that are either thrown out of balconies or going to be thrown out of balconies, let's talk about sort of your own career in this. We can kind of wrap up with this because, as listeners might know, in academia, the sort of stuff that you cover, and like we've talked about on the show, I mean, we've talked about in this conversation, sort of conspiracy theories or deep politics, parapolitics, these things are not necessarily looked very kindly upon by many of the people who run the academic institutions in this country. So basically, how did you get interested in this, and why did you decide to throw away any tenure chances that you might have should you decide to pursue them in the pursuit of this?
Yeah, I'm not totally resigned to having thrown away any chances, but I knew that I was not making a good career move in the conventional sense. I grew up in a household that was Democratic. My mom worked for a Democratic congressman in Southern Indiana, so I was more to the left than my friends in school. I was one of the only people who was like for Dukakis in 1988, for example. And so I grew up around politics and around the Ron-Contra hearings. I actually remember those from when I was a kid, and I think they had some impact. And I majored in political science in college, and my favorite professor was a vaguely liberal guy, but he, made me think more deeply about America's political history and so on. I went to Taiwan for a year, and it was around 2000. And then Bush stole the election. I came back to the United States. And then like a week later, 9/11 happens. And that was not, I was not happy about that because I thought it was bad that this was happening under Bush and that bad things were going to follow. But I wasn't interested. I wasn't traumatized by the events because I just didn't want to watch them that day for whatever reason. Like I didn't want to watch the media coverage. I thought, well, I'll read about it later, but this is not good that this is happening now. And then all those flags come out. We invade Afghanistan. We have the Iraq War, which to me seems so obviously criminal that I almost thought, or actually I did think this has to be derailed before it happens. It's so obviously gangster.
Yeah.
But then it happened. And then in 2004, I worked for the Democratic National Committee, like a subcontractor of theirs, doing like political canvassing and stuff. And hoped that Kerry would win, but was not happy that it was Kerry because he was a little more on the main centrist side. In 2008, I worked on Barack Obama's campaign, and I moved to Missouri, as a field organizer there. And I thought I might try to get a job in the White House after that. I went to the inauguration. I went to the inaugural ball, the staff ball, and like Jay-Z. Arcade Fire played for us personally, and Obama.
Well, that's
came
a
out.
throwback. Jay-Z
You
and
got to
Arcade
see
Fire.
Jay-Z.
I did, and I'm not a bit huge Jay-Z fan.
Me
I'm not.
either. But
I
it's
mostly.
that's cool that you did.
Yeah. No, it was cool, and there were these. It was just really cool. The whole thing was really fun, and I liked the people that I worked with. But I realized already that I was kind of more to the left than them, especially on foreign policy issues. They didn't really seem to have much of an interest in foreign policy. But after Obama got elected, and he, kicked all those people out of their homes, but bailed out the bankers. And the government of Honduras got overthrown, and Libya, especially Libya. I just felt that there is some sort of permanent apparatus, and it made me go back and study more things. I'd seen JFK as a kid, and I saw Oliver Stone around 2009 or so come out and said, "You should read this book, JFK and the Unspeakable." And so I thought, I'm underemployed, so I'll read this book. And I read that book on the Kennedy assassination. I thought, this is so. The case here, even if he gets some of the details wrong, especially about Dallas itself, because it's really complicated and whatever, like the evidence about the foreign policy differences and the things that Kennedy was trying to do and that he wasn't able to do, and the changes back to the Eisenhower Dulles consensus with LBJ, it just was very clear that there was some sort of thing at work here. And so I just started to read more in that vein, and I contacted Lance DeHaven Smith while I was in this process of just doing all this reading and research on things. And I don't know if you know Lance or not. He's retired now as a public administration professor at Florida State and really prominent in Florida politics and society. At one year, this magazine in Florida said he was the number 4 scientist in the whole state of Florida. He was best friends with Reuben Askew, who was the governor of Florida. And he saw the election get stolen in 2000, and he was an expert on Florida politics, and he just thought, this is criminal, and these people are able to break laws. And so with impunity, and he developed this concept of state crimes against democracy. And he and a few other scholars went to conferences, and I contacted Lance out of the blue. I just called him, which is a skill that I guess I got from the political thing with Obama.
Probably.
Yeah. Being like,
no
hey,
fear.
is this? Yeah.
I mean, it was so annoying, and I hated doing it. But the greatest thing about that Obama job, and why I don't regret it, is that it made me realize that you have to go out there and communicate with people and talk to people. And I don't the generic term would be networking, and I don't like to. I hate thinking of that way. I had never wanted to go to business school or be any sort of corporate toady, thinking like it's networking time. Scanning the room like, who should I be networking with, right?
No, but working on a political campaign definitely gets you more used to talking to strangers, which is a skill that a lot of people don't have.
Yeah. And so I called Lance, and I just started talking to him. Really, I was really happy that he was taking the time to talk to me, and I'd read his papers. And he said, man, he's got Lance from Georgia. He's got a little bit of a drawl, even more than me being from almost Kentucky. He said, "Man, I'm like the expert in this stuff in academia, but you really know this stuff. You know this stuff just as well as me." And I started emailing him back and forth. We would just have these long email exchanges. He put me in the acknowledgments to his book, Conspiracy Theory in America, which is published by University of Texas Press, and it actually looks at the way conspiracy theory gets sort of turned into a weaponized idea used to basically discourage people from looking at state crimes against democracy. And he said he made a lot of these other findings about political assassinations and different theories to try to explain this and why public administration can't deal with it. And so I went to grad school, and instead of doing things with people in my department, I went to conferences with Lance and a small group of public administration people doing this kind of work. But some of them died. Like 2 of them had heart attacks, Alex Kuzman and Kim Thorne. Matt Witt is still around. He's a great academic and a good friend of Lance's and mine. I stayed with him in LA recently. But then Lance has Parkinson's and he's retired, and it's I don't hear from him that much anymore, and Matt doesn't either. But he was really fearless. But I got a history teaching job, had a kid, and then finished my dissertation, and started working with Peter Dale Scott a little bit and communicating more with him. And he said he wanted me to work on this book with him. That's his last collection of deep politics essays and such that he's probably going to publish. We did that article together on the Massoud assassination. And I just had him at my class show up to a couple of my peace studies classes that I teach here outside of Philadelphia. I had him and Dan Ellsberg because they're really good friends, and they showed up to my students, talked to my students, and Joshua Oppenheimer, who directed The Act of Killing, came, and Catherine Gunn came to one recently with Ellsberg and James Galbraith and Peter Kuznick. I've worked with Peter Kuznick, gone to Japan with him. I teach a class that he and Oliver Stone contributed to. And so these people that I've been able to befriend are out there trying to, in different ways, speak out about this sort of imperial behemoth that we're dealing with, and it's a small group, but a dedicated group. And I ended up way more radical. My mom, who still watches she watches MSNBC now all the time, and I'm just trying to say, Mom, you gotta stop, Mom.
The Russians is a typical thing with a lot of moms.
The Russians aren't going to harm you. The bots aren't coming for you. She's not really
the Russians
that bad,
did shut off the power, right? Wasn't that like a big thing a couple of years ago?
Oh my God. Do you remember that was so crazy?
They can just dial up on a mini 9/11 anytime. They can just say, intelligence reports say the Russians just hacked us again.
You know it's going to get worse with Biden's foreign policy team.
Yeah. So I'm planning now to get this book published in one way or another, my dissertation, which I know would be very interesting to you guys. I cover a lot of things. I even go into Epstein and the history of sexual blackmail. There's an angle of Watergate that deals with that as well. I write about BCCI. I write about the Safari Club. There's a ton in there that whenever it does come out, I'd be happy to come back on and do some shows on these. I think that you and your readers will appreciate the book. It might need to be rewritten in less academic terms, although I try not to be a terrible political science writer. It's
all listeners are addicted to Adderall. It's fine.
As long as you don't snort it, I think it's okay,
it's all.
Right?
That's the same with everything. That's the same with all drugs.
Yeah,
I don't know about that.
I'm just kidding.
Well, just the problem with doing illegal drugs is that makes it tough for a person of good conscience to bear, is that you end up supporting U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly.
Especially cocaine.
Especially cocaine. And you can't really justify it. The most bourgeois drug.
That's why I had to get sober. It's because I couldn't stand
supporting.
I'm going to start saying that now. Yeah, I'm like, no, I got sober because it's bad, slavery and all that stuff.
Yeah, you should just anybody that you see with the crack pipe, just tell them, put that down.
Yeah.
You're supporting U.S. imperialism every time that you hit that crack pipe. In the 80s, the war on drugs, Nancy Reagan, the cosmic joke about all of that is that the Contras were the biggest cocaine traffickers, and the Mujahideen were the biggest heroin traffickers.
Yeah.
Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was the world's biggest heroin trafficker at that time. So this stuff is.
I love saying that guy's name.
It's amazing.
It feels very cool to say it. It feels like you know a lot more than you should.
Yeah.
I think I can spell it. I'm not gonna. Don't ask me to do it now, but I think if I had a whiteboard, I could do it.
I can't do it in my head. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure. One quick thing. Is it okay for us to link to this essay in here?
I don't think there's a link. I just have a PDF of it.
Which the essay, the American exception
the American
one?
exception. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll eventually, I think that I'm actually allowed to post that on my own personal website. So, but the problem is, as soon as I finished my dissertation, I had to do virtual teaching, and it's so time intensive. I thought it was the light at the end of the tunnel, getting the dissertation done, and then the tunnel, I emerge and I go into COVID teaching, virtual teaching.
Yeah.
So these things that I plan to do, I haven't done. I can post that essay. You can link to the Covert Action Magazine article.
Okay,
and you
great.
can link to the one in Administration and Society, but it's behind a paywall. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Aaron. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading the dissertation, brother.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that you guys are doing very interesting work, and even some of my students have listened to your podcast, which is kind of funny to me. So
hopefully they listen to this
cool.
one. If they're listening, was your teacher's cool?
Thank you. I think that endorsement will help my cause.
All right, and signing off. That's TrueAnon, baby. No, I don't have any plans. I do have plans, but I'm not telling you about them.
Yeah, I have plans too, but I'm not telling you.
I know you don't have plans.
I do have plans.
How can you have You got plans?
I got so many plans.
What are you doing?
So
text me. You don't have to say on the show. Just text me. What are you doing? No, I plan on I'm pacing, and I'm gonna see if my neighbor cares if I shoot a hole in the wall of the apartment.
Don't do that.
Well, they might not care.
Well, I guess you gotta find out.
It's really hot in here, and I'm sick of opening the windows. Bird
Oh
could
my
fly
god.
in.
It's too hot, it's too cold.
It's always too hot. It's never too cold. You never hear me complaining about that. I have a hot apartment. Anyways.
That's not true. I've definitely been to your old apartment where you've been like, God, it's so cold in here. Turn the heat on.
Yeah, okay. Well, fine. Anyways. This has been a little fun episode.
Yeah. I'm Liz.
My name is Brace. We are joined, of course, by producer Young Chomsky and... caught you up there, huh? You thought I was going to say something else. Right? Classic prank.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Jeffrey Epstein.